Hello, everyone. Welcome to Royal Black and Elite. I'm Lady T. Now, today's lecture is going to be about Moms Mabley. Moms Mabley was very famous during the vaudeville era. Vaudeville era was a time, it was variety shows, and they were really popular back in the 1870s, all the way really to like the 1930s. And black vaudeville was like a parallel to white vaudeville. And the reason is because black people could not perform in most of these establishments. Now, these were like the right after the time of freak shows. Now, freak shows were time when people from all different races would come and they would do these shows. And I left a link down below of the Carolina twins. And they would go and they would have like two heads or, have man, half woman or have man, half animal. So all that kind of stuff. So this is the era that she came out of. And she toured the Chitlin circuit. So the vaudeville era was right after that. So all of these performers would come together and they would give a show. And Moms Mabley was a comedian and she was the top of the line in that period. Now, some of her show was kind of controversial, and we'll get into that a little bit. So I think you're going to find her life very interesting. If you love Monique, if you love some more, if you love to laugh, Moms Mabley would be someone that you would go see in that day. Now, the men who took after her persona of Moms Mabley was people like Tyler Perry and even Flip Wilson. So this is kind of where this came from. Now, she was born on March the 19th, 1897 in Brevard, North Carolina. Her family, let me tell you, she was one of 16 or 17 children. We're not really sure. Now, her father's name was James, and he was a businessman, and also he took in boarders. That became a problem. And her mother's name was Mary. Now, Mabley, she really had a tough life. Her real name was Loretta Marie Aiken. And she had a tough life from the very beginning because at only 11 years old, she was assaulted. And at 13, she was assaulted again by a white sheriff. So she had two children that she gave up for adoption. When she was 11, she was impregnated, and she was impregnated by a very old man. Well, by 1911, her grandmother said, baby, listen, run away, get away from here. And, you can kind of see why. If by 13, she had had two children and had been assaulted, and the family had 16 children, it probably was a pretty rough life. So she did run away. And she joined a traveling minstrel show. So this was a freak show, minstrel show, vaudeville. So you can just see all of these people performing in these different eras and genres. Sadly, only 1 year, y'all, after running away, her father passed away. He was a volunteer fireman, and the truck that they were riding in blew up. There was no safety back then. And then 1 year later, her mother passed away. And I mean, this is sad how she passed, but it's almost comical if it wasn't so sad. She was walking home after church on Christmas Day and was run over by a truck. Have you ever heard of anything so terrible? So both of her parents passed in motor vehicle accidents, and actually there was no safety back in those days either. So despite this, her, traveling and really was making money at that time, was at least beginning to make money and able to support some of the family. Her brother said, "No, you kick rocks. You need to get away," because being a performer back in those days was pretty tantamount to walking the street, being a streetwalker. So even though that's not what she was doing, she was actually doing comedy. They didn't like it, so she changed her name to Mabley initially. Now, the reason she used Mabley is because she was engaged to this guy named Jack, but she and Jack didn't work out. Partly because early in her career, Moms came out as liking women, shall we say. She even dressed like a man during her performances. So, even though she had 6 kids by the end of her life, she also protect of the women as well. So this is the life that she lived. But it didn't take her long to really blow up. She owned the stage. She was really funny, and she was traveling in the Chitlin circuit. And that was the circuit where people would go to the predominantly black communities and perform. Listen, I left a video down below of all the black established communities throughout the country in that time period. Really interesting. Detroit is in there, Atlanta is in there. So definitely check that one out. So she would travel, and this is when she debuted in Harlem. So this is when she began to blow up at this place called Connie's Inn. And they really loved her. Now, people during that time, there was another guy named Burt Williams. He was like the most famous man during that time, but he dressed up in blackface. So, there was a lot of controversy. And even Moms Mabley persona really had a lot of controversy because it was embarrassing for them to be out there talking like that and, kind of leading, feeding into the stereotype that existed at the time period. So, people felt differently about her. Now, in 1939, Mabley became the first female comic to perform at the famed Apollo Theater. Rest in peace, Kiki Shepard. And Mabley's claim to fame became her mom's persona. And she really took that on because the people who were traveling in the show with her, they really felt like she was their mother. And so she called herself Moms Mabley. And she would dress in, she would be toothless. She would wear a raggedy dress and she would wear a big floppy hat. So she became very famous because of that. Now, one thing she would always say is she would make a point to make sure that people knew she liked young men and she did not like old geezers. One of the reasons is because I believe it's because she was assaulted at 11 years old by what she defined as a geezer. The men who wear the polyester pants pulled up above their navel. Yeah, that was usually brown. Y'all please put a like down below. If you know what I'm talking about, please put a comment down below. Now, about 1962, Mabley had gotten so big, she performed at Carnegie Hall. She was making about $10,000 a week at that time. She also appeared on the Smothers Brothers, and she even had a record on Billboard on July 19th, 1969. She was 75 years old, and she was the oldest performer ever to be on Billboard. Now, Mabley continued performing into her older years, appearing on The Pearl Bailey Show in the early 1970s, and she even opened for Ike and Tina Turner. Now, Mabley suffered a heart attack in 1974, and a year later, she had to have a pacemaker put in. She had a pacemaker put in, but a year later, she passed away on May 23rd, 1975, in White Plains, New York. And that's really where she lived, and that's really where she kind of performed the rest of her life when she did start performing. Now, Mabley did have 4 children outside of the 2 children that she gave up for adoption, but she never did marry. Her 4 children did receive her estate upon her passing, and they received $500,000. Now, she passed away in White Plains, and that is where she's also buried. So that is Moms Mabley. Have you ever heard of Moms? This is well before a lot of people's time. But if you, again, like Monique Samore, Tiffany Haddish, any of these comics that are out today, they tip their hat and give their credit to Moms Mabley for putting it all on the line and opening up doors for her. And from her pain, making other people laugh. So I thank you all for joining me for another great episode of Royal Black and Elite. Now remember, my lessons are for education and entertainment purposes only, and the fair act use is in my description. Now, if you want to continue to learn, I'll put those other videos down below, the Carolina twins, the black business districts. I think you really enjoy those. And I want to thank you for joining me for another great episode of Royal Black and Elite. Hit that like, share, and subscribe. And y'all, hype a girl up. I really do appreciate you, and have a great day.